get 'em all. Zombie gang. White Mike. Louis, what up? Hate me or love me. Love me or hate me. You gon' know what the fuck I am.
I never do. Yeah. One thing I never do.
Let's go.
One thing I never do. One thing I never do.
One thing I never do. One thing I never do. One thing I never do is put on no show. One thing I never do. One thing I never do. One thing I never do is wipe up these hoes. One thing I never do. One thing I never do. One thing I never do is act like no bitch. One thing I never do. One thing I never do. One thing I never do is sell out a split. One thing I never do, give fuck about no hate. One thing I never do is change once I make it. One thing I never do is show these fuck no mercy. One thing I never do is leave my homies hurting. One thing I never do is forget I gotta pray to God. One thing I never do is forget my homie Deshaun. One thing I never do is have my kids hungry. One thing I never do is trade my soul for money. One thing I never do is have that chamber empty. One thing I never do, that bitch shit ain't in me. One thing I never do is trade my wife for sluts. One thing you better know is all my homies bust. One thing I never do is dress like no damn bum. One thing I never do is forget where the fuck I came from. One thing I never do is back down, ain't running. One thing I always do is keep shit 100. One thing I never do, one thing I never do, one thing I never do is put on no show. One thing I never do, one thing I never do, one thing I never do is wipe up these hoes. One thing I never do, one thing I never do, one thing I never do is act like no bitch. One thing I never do, one thing I never do, one thing I never do is sell out a split.
One thing that I never do is be treated like no pussy nigga. This Machiavelli reincarnated. I am not a killer, but don't push me, nigga. Cause one thing that I never do is cop no plea in no situation. We can go to war with no hesitation. You a king, it's time for your resignation. Cause the real niggas, we back. And one thing that I never do is not murder y'all on these tracks. And another thing that I never do is hate another nigga that's whack. But y'all sucker niggas don't understand it. Domination from another planet. Steady winning, they can't stand it. I keep it thuggin' like always. I ain't never snitched on damn nigga. One thing that I never do is perpetrate to y'all damn picture. One thing that I never do is roll a cushion, no damn switcher, or tellin' none of my fam, nigga. All the real niggas, I stand with you. One thing that I never do is hit the mall and shop. Never. One thing that I won't forget is how to work that pot. Never. Only thing that y'all know is Louis man be wildin'. And the only thing that I show is I keep it shit 1,000.
One thing I never do, one thing I never do, one thing I never do is put on no show. One thing I never do, one thing I never do, one thing I never do is wipe up these hoes. One thing I never do, one thing I never do, one thing I never do is act like no bitch. One thing I never do, one thing I never do, one thing I never do is sell out a split.
One thing I never do is turn into a snitch. If he act like he invisible, I show him how quick I send a hit. How quick this girl to get flipped? Tell me how quick you put in your clip. I'm a fine boy off real. You gon' expect the sign be clear. One thing I never do is hit my homeboy chick. Don't care, she got an ass like Nicki Minaj or Pamela Anderson tits. That's one thing I never do. That's one thing I never do. Y'all rappers mad at me. I'm nice and I'm incredible. How you gonna act when we on the top? Going platinum, pulling power moves. You gonna hate, put dirt on my name, and that's something I never do. I'm the hottest rapper, yeah, I'm better than you. Throw it off, yeah, I'm mystical. Unidentified but typical. I can go to more than something you can't do. One thing I never do is forget about the grind when they never gave me nothing. I hustle from 9 to 9. One thing I never do is forget about my pops. He was the heart of the streets, that's why he'll never be forgot. Hey,
one thing I never do, one thing I never do, one thing I never do is put on no show. One thing I never do, one thing